Caution! The AJ and Quill show contains D&D content and is intended for a D&D audience. And, besides that, they're really weird. Hi everyone, welcome to Total Party Quill. I'm your host, AJ, your friendly neighborhood tiefling, and as always, here's my fearless companion, Quill the Dragon. Quill, say hi.
Greetings, puny humans. Has my reputation preceded me, or was I too quick for it?
So Wizards of the Coast released Icewind Dale, Rime the Frostmaiden, a new adventure campaign, and we're going to be continuing our series on covering monster tactics for creatures that you're going to find inside that adventure.
This week we're tackling the big baddie of the whole thing. That's Auril the Frostmaiden.
Right, it's exciting. Auril the Frostmaiden is actually a lesser god inside the Forgotten Realms, and she's one of the main villains inside this adventure.
Auril has some unique mechanics that we haven't seen inside 5th edition yet.
And plus, you're going to be battling an actual god. Who can say that?
Well, you could fight Tiamat in the last few adventures. She's a dragon god, you know.
Right, that's right. Tiamat is a god. You did fight a god before in a previous adventure. Never mind.
But let's not waste any more time. You got questions. We got answers.
Let's get panel showy. Unlikely things to hear at an awards ceremony. And the winner for most dramatic pause at an awards ceremony goes to... And that's right, we're going to be covering an actual lesser god inside the Forgotten Realms, Auril the Frostmaiden.
But let's cover some of the lore so that people aren't caught unawares. Auril is the neutral evil lesser god of cold indifference who embodies winter's cruelty inside the Forgotten Realms.
Now, lesser gods or lesser deities are a divine rank inside a Dungeons & Dragons adventure, and you can find a sidebar for that on page 11 of the 5th edition Dungeon Master's Guide.
Lesser deities, unlike greater deities, actually live somewhere inside the planes.
Right, and this is opposed to greater deities who actually exist outside of mortal understanding.
Lesser deities have a physical presence somewhere inside the realms.
That's right. Some deities, like Laru the Unicorn Queen, actually exist in the material plane. You can physically go and find them.
The titanic sharp god Sokola is another such example of this.
Other lesser deities exist on different planes, like how Loth the Spider Queen exists in the Abyss.
There's a third kind of deity which is akin to a demigod. If you check out the monster manual, you'll see creatures like Empyreans are covered under this.
But the big question is, why is Auril in Icewind Dale in the first place? Why are the gods hiding out in the material plane?
This has to do with the lore inside the Forgotten Realms. During the time of troubles, the gods had to descend down to the material plane to exist because Overlord Ao kicked them out.
And you should totally research this lore for yourself if you're going to be playing inside the Forgotten Realms for this adventure.
The creator of the Forgotten Realms, Mr. Ed Greenwood himself, is a fantastic resource for this. He tirelessly donates his time and energy and knowledge to help players struggling to make characters inside the Forgotten Realms.
Which is amazing. He created them, so he's really the guy to go to for lore.
And he's a wonderful man.
Now as for why Auril's in Icewind Dale in the first place, Auril was actually part of the Gods of Fury.
This was an alignment between Talos, Umberlee, Malar, and Auril. Kind of like a fancy club.
And at one point, the Goddess of the Seas,
that's the bitch queen, Umberlee,
was a staunch ally of Auril.
But the Queen of Wrathful Seas grew to despise the enduring nature of the ice and snow Auril created.
Right, Umberlee didn't like Auril turning her chaotic and unpredictable tides into these rigid, motionless sheets of ice.
So Umberlee brought Talos and Malar into an alliance against Auril.
Those three deities sought to take down the Frostmaiden, and she was forced to retreat to the most frigid regions on Toril.
The Frozen North, or Icewind Dale.
Now, the Goddess of Winter seemingly created an eternal winter up in Icewind Dale.
Auril has created an eternal night over Icewind Dale, but casting such great magic night after night, while also granting spells to her faithful followers, leaves Auril weak and
And in this self-inflicted, weakened state, Auril is actually cautious against meeting creatures that could harm her, because in this state she could be slain by mortal creatures.
Something that doesn't usually happen to gods.
But in this state, if Auril's actually slain, she doesn't really die how we understand it. She would simply cease to exist until the next winter solstice, where she would be resurrected as herself at full strength. But let's give some tips on role-playing Auril. Tip number 1. Inside combat, Auril should be virtually silent.
She should speak only when absolutely necessary when meeting the characters in person. The less she talks, the better, because it creates more of an air of mystery around her.
Also because, as DMs, we're not gods, we don't really understand how gods' minds really work, so there's less of a chance that the DM is going to screw up and say something inaccurate or wrong that a god would never say, and kind of take the fun out of it for the players.
Rule number 2.
Auril can't really die, and she knows it.
Auril is the embodiment of winter's cruelty. She is incapable of showing mercy or compassion.
Auril is the supreme manifestation of cold and unfeeling. Tip number 3. Lesser gods are powerful, but they're also very arrogant.
Auril actually can't conceive of losing and acts as such. She would tend to underestimate any mortal opponents, being incapable of believing that they could really harm her.
And while Auril is in this weakened state, her hubris could actually lead to her downfall. But let's get right into it. Let's put it all together. How would Auril behave in combat when your characters finally get the chance to meet her inside Icewind Dale Rime of the Frostmaiden?
Fighting a god is serious business, and characters who don't take it seriously deserve to get annihilated for their arrogance, if nothing else.
Now, inside the Frozen North, Auril has a floating island that she lives on, and if characters encounter her on the island, which they probably will, she also has lair actions.
Lair actions are like a small mini-action that a creature can take on initiative count 20.
Right, but her options aren't exactly combat intensive for her lair actions. They're really meant more to play a storytelling element.
For Auril's first lair action, she instantly knows the health and location of all creatures on her island. She knows how much damage each creature has taken, and how many levels of exhaustion they have, and what conditions are affecting them. Auril's second lair action is that she instantly can teleport to any location on the island.
Now this lair action could be useful in combat. On initiative count 20, Auril can teleport anywhere on the combat field. This should be used to frustrate characters who are engaged with her.
Auril's third lair action is that she can telepathically communicate with any number of creatures at once, provided they are all on her island. This effect will last until Auril stops concentrating on it, as though it was a spell.
Or until she leaves the island or uses a different lair action. Now a really good use for this, roleplay wise, is to have Auril constantly taunt the characters as they advance through her island.
If one of the characters gets hit, perhaps Auril whispers in their ear about how pathetic they are, about how feeble their chances are, and how stupid they look.
Yeah, but you're the DM, so play around with it. Now, of those lair actions on initiative count 20, Auril being able to teleport around, or knowing exactly what a creature's health or vulnerabilities or how much exhaustion it has, are useful, and she should absolutely use these two when she's encountering the player characters in combat. But let's get on to Auril, the really juicy stuff.
In her current weakened state, Auril can assume only 3 forms. To destroy her, characters must reduce each form to 0 hit points, one after the other.
And after the characters defeat her third and final form by reducing it to 0 hit points, Auril is dead.
But not really. As long as she has mortal followers worshipping her, Auril is reborn at full strength during the next winter solstice, with divine power far beyond what is reflected in this adventure.
Now, the statistics for Auril's 3 different forms can be found in Appendix C of Icewind Dale Rime of the Frostmaiden.
It's important to remember that these statistics do not reflect Auril at her full power, but rather Auril as she is encountered inside this adventure in a severely weakened state.
Right, Auril is literally stopping the sun from shining. That's an incredibly powerful thing to do, and it really drains her magic.
It's also perhaps the only reason that any character would even have a chance of taking her on.
Auril's first form. Auril appears as a hunched, 7-foot-tall biped with the head of a snowy owl, black talons, cloven hooves, and the gray fur of a wolf covering her body from the neck down.
And protruding from Auril's owl-like head are curved horns like a ram. Or like mine.
In this form, Auril wears a cloak made of pristine white snow, which conceals much of her tripartite form.
Auril's worshippers refer to this form as the Cold Crone.
The cloak made of snow that Auril wears in this form can transform into a pair of owl's wing whenever Auril wishes it.
And this cloak gives her a flying speed of 60 feet, which is reflected in her stats. Speaking of stats, let's cover them.
Auril is a CR9 medium monstrosity in her first form. She has 95 hit points, a speed of 30 with a flying speed of 60 feet.
Auril in this form has proficiency in Con and Wisdom saves, which covers 2 of the big 3 saves that most characters are going to have to roll against. And she is a god, so she has a whole bunch of immunities and resistances, although she in this form also has a vulnerability to radiant damage.
The Cold Crone also has legendary resistance and magic resistance. This, coupled with her true sight ability, make her laugh in the magic of puny mortals who try to deceive her.
Now, because of her legendary resistance, anytime Auril would fail a saving throw, she uses this ability to succeed instead. Her saves are really good, and it's not going to happen very often, so there's no point in her trying to save this.
Plus, when Auril transforms into a different form, she regains this ability.
Now, looking at Auril's stats, which are insanely high, the primary defensive ability of her forms is Constitution, while her primary attack ability is going to be her Charisma.
This means Auril is a caster who doesn't mind mixing it up a little in melee combat.
Now, on the first round of combat, if Auril is not engaged in melee combat, she uses her innate flying speed to fly 30 feet into the air,
or as high as possible given the height restrictions of wherever she's at.
And from 30 feet she casts Ice Storm on the characters. Now, if you check out the Monsters and Area Effect table inside the Dungeon Master's Guide, you can see that Auril's going to try to get at least 4 of the characters inside the radius. But in this case, it's not really necessary because that spell also makes the area in that radius difficult terrain.
This is an advantage Auril will use if she has to engage in melee combat.
Right, and on subsequent turns, after she's cast Ice Storm, she'll just cast Chromatic Orb instead.
Auril remains flying until the characters find some way to neutralize her flight ability.
Or if at least half the characters in the party are able to effectively attack her at range.
Or if the characters are able to take cover from her spells. Auril will then land and engage in melee combat.
Right, but if the characters don't actually do any of these things, she's going to stay flying.
Creatures that can fly don't fight non-flying creatures from the ground.
Being able to fly is just too much of an advantage to give up. But if Auril is forced to engage in melee combat, the way her statistics look, she plays more of like a hit-and-run character.
Auril stays around 30 feet away from her opponents, rushing in using her flight speed.
Which, being flying, would also negate the difficult terrain from her Ice Storm spell from earlier.
And then Auril attacks using her Touch of Frost ability. After her attack, she uses Misty Step as a bonus action to teleport 30 feet away from her opponents.
Now, Touch of Frost is not actually a spell. It's an ability that Auril has. So it's not subject to the cantrip-only rules that apply when casting spells as a bonus action.
However, if she tried to cast Chromatic Orb and Misty Step in the same turn, this would come into play.
And this is basically how Auril's going to play out in combat. She'll rush in from 30 feet away because her flight speed is 60. She'll attack using her Touch of Frost, and then she'll Misty Step away.
Anytime Auril is able to use a bonus action, she casts Misty Step.
Right, because she doesn't actually have any other bonus actions to be able to use anyway. Think of Auril as teleporting in, attacking, then mysteriously teleporting away through a veil of snow and ice.
Like a snow ninja.
Now, something to note is that if Auril has advantage on her attacks, instead of using her Touch of Frost ability, she's going to use her multi-attack to attack the creature, because it would actually do more damage. But this is only if she has advantage. Now, all of Auril's 3 forms have legendary actions that she can take on another creature's turn.
In her first form, the Cold Crone, Auril uses her Talon's legendary action whenever an opponent ends its turn in melee range of Auril.
Right, but if a second character engages Auril in melee range, instead of using her Talon's action, she uses her Misty Step legendary action to teleport 30 feet away from any of the other player characters.
This makes Auril harder to nail down and hit. It should frustrate your characters how much she's teleporting around the entire battlefield. She'll be bouncing around the battlefield so much the characters will think she's a blink dog.
Now, aside from teleporting every bonus action, on initiative count 20, she's going to do another teleport.
Using her lair action.
So Auril in this monstrosity form is just a teleporting, sneak attacking, bouncing, hit and run damage machine.
When reduced to 0 hit points, Auril magically transforms into her second form.
As you pierce the divine heart of this creature, it dissolves into a whirlwind of snowflakes and wind. The snowflakes begin to churn and coalesce, collecting and binding together, solidifying into a solid ice form, taking the shape of a giant 10-foot tall female goddess made entirely of ice. Auril's second form. In this form, Auril is known to her followers as the Brittle Maiden.
This is a 10-foot tall woman made entirely of ice. Blades grow out of her body at odd angles as she moves about, and the ice cracks and crinkles as she moves.
The lore says that Auril makes weapons out of these icicles sticking out of her.
In this form, Auril is a large, neutral evil elemental creature.
As the Brittle Maiden, Auril has an AC of 16 and 136 hit points. And while most of her stats remain the same, she loses her vulnerability to radiant damage and instead gains vulnerability to fire.
Well, she is made of ice. That makes sense, doesn't it?
Now, as the Brittle Maiden, on the first round of combat, Auril will reposition herself so that she can cast Cone of Cold on as many of the player characters as possible.
While repositioning, Auril also tries to get at least one melee character inside her range. On the second round of combat, Auril uses her Ice Stasis against an opponent with the lowest Charisma saving throw.
Now, looking at Auril's stats, she's absolutely smart enough to be able to read a character's stats. Her intelligence, coupled with her lair actions, will allow her to know exactly which characters have what saving throws, what their hit points are. She's going to know everything about them while they're fighting.
And when using her Ice Stasis ability, Auril is going to give preference to any character with a low Constitution save who did the most damage to her in the preceding round.
Now, at the start of the third round, Auril is going to engage in melee and use her multi-attack ability.
Auril's multi-attack allows her to attack twice with her Ice Morning Stars. If no opponent is within 30 feet of Auril when she does this, she instead uses her Create Method ability. And this is because you simply can't ready a multi-attack action instead.
Now for her legendary actions.
Auril uses her attack legendary action to make one Ice Morningstar attack against any opponent who ends its turn within melee range of Auril.
And using the Targets and Area Effect table on page 249 of the 5th edition Monster Manual, we can see that Auril is going to use her Ice Fury legendary action if she can get at least 6 of the player characters inside the radius. However, since most player character parties aren't this big, Auril's instead going to use this action if she can just get all the player characters inside the radius.
Auril will use her Splinter legendary action only if no other options are any good at that moment, or if she still has all her legendary actions and they are about to recharge the next turn.
And this is basically combat for her second form. She'll continue attacking the characters until they reduce her to 0 hit points.
Then she will enter her third and final form.
As your blade makes its final strike against the Brittle Maiden, you can see cracks begin to form where your blade struck. These cracks begin to reach all through the body, eventually encompassing her whole form. The Brittle Maiden shatters in front of you, revealing a core of ice where her heart would have been.
Auril's third form is called Winter's Womb, or the Queen of Frozen Tears by her mortal followers.
In this form, Auril is a 3-foot diameter ice diamond, containing the god's divine spark inside of it.
The diamond has many faucets and sharp points at the bottom. It hovers in the air, radiating intense cold all around it. And when Auril speaks, her voice seems to emanate from within the diamond itself.
Now in this final form, Auril is a small, neutral evil elemental.
The Queen of Frozen Tears has an AC of 19 and 136 hit points. She has a speed of 0, but a flying speed of 30 feet, and she can hover.
Also to note, because of this crystalline form, she's also now vulnerable to thunder damage. Now, on the first round of combat in this third and final form, Auril first uses her Blizzard Veil ability to heavily obscure a 30-foot radius sphere all around her.
Now, Auril can fly 30 feet in this form, but her Frigid Aura ability indicates a preference for close combat.
Auril lets the characters come to her. Now with her Blizzard's Veil ability, it heavily obscures the area all around her for a radius of 30 feet. But remember, Auril has blind sight. She can see perfectly fine through all of this.
This is similar to the Devil's Sight Darkness combo that many warlocks use.
Right, and because the characters can't see her, they'll have disadvantage to attacks against her. But because she can see them while they can't see her, her attacks have advantage.
On the second round of combat, Auril uses her multi-attack action to cast Polar Ray twice.
Right, and during combat, if Auril ever loses concentration on her Blizzard Veil ability, on her next turn she'll simply recast it, using her legendary actions to do damage instead.
Speaking of legendary actions, if we use the targets in area effect table, Auril uses her Intensify Aura legendary action if 2 or more opponents are within 10 feet of her.
Yeah, and otherwise she's just going to use her Polar Ray legendary action.
If Auril loses concentration on her Blizzard Veil ability, at the end of that turn she uses her Blinding Gleam legendary action as Winter Veil drops, and her ice form is revealed.
Now if Auril is killed in this third and final form, she's dead, until the next winter solstice, where she's going to be reformed at her full power.
Provided she still has followers who worship her.
Now, because Auril is an immortal god, she doesn't actually suffer a morale failure like we say most creatures do. Auril knows that she can't die. Dying for Auril at this point is merely a giant inconvenience.
This is important to remember because it means Auril will not flee from mortals if she's reduced to hit points in combat.
Auril's simply incapable of conceiving any mortal of being able to defeat her.
Also, because she is the embodiment of winter's cold indifference, Auril is incapable of showing mercy or compassion, although she might choose to entomb or imprison PCs rather than killing them outright.
Now something else to remember is that you have to defeat these 3 forms in order. It's kind of like a level up boss fight in a video game.
But if you don't defeat all 3 forms in order, the next time Auril takes a long rest, she'll simply regenerate back to her first form.
Yeah, and then you have to restart all over again. But that's it. We hope this is enough information to get you going using Auril inside Icewind Dale, Rime of the Frostmaiden. She has some really cool mechanics. You haven't really seen anything like this inside 5th edition yet, and I think your players are going to have a lot of fun either fighting Auril or trying to find a way to defeat her without actually killing her, because they may not be able to. And we'd like to offer our most humblest apologies to the wonderful and amazing Mr. Ed Greenwood. We're sorry, bud, we wanted to get you on the air, we just ran out of time. But let's get to what you've all been waiting for, Quill's Joke of the Day. Quill?
What do you call a fairy who doesn't like to shower?
I don't know. What do you call a fairy who doesn't like to shower?
Stinker Bell.
Anyway, don't forget to tune in next time when our special guest will be the hilarious Mr. Matthew Lillard from Scooby-Doo fame.
And don't forget Beetle and Grimm.
Right, let's not forget that. Those guys are awesome. And we hope to see you then. Bye!
Bye!
Yeah, 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 yeah.